The rifle barrel trembled against Cordelia Whitmore's shoulder as she aimed at what she'd first mistaken for a wounded bear stumbling through her cornfield. Through the driving rain, the dark figure collapsed just 20 paces from her porch. And that's when she heard it, the thin, desperate cry of an infant cutting through the thunder. She lowered her weapon and stepped into the storm. The man lay face down in the mud, his long black hair plastered to his neck, buckskin clothing torn and bloodied. In his arms, wrapped in what looked like a piece of his own shirt, was a baby no more than a few months old. The child's cries had weakened to pitiful mewls. "Lord, have mercy," Cordelia whispered, then louder. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes, fluttered open, dark as midnight and filled with a pain that went deeper than his physical wounds. He tried to push himself up but collapsed again, his grip never loosening on the baby. "Please," he gasped in English, heavily accented. "My daughter. She needs—" "Hush now," Cordelia commanded, the same tone she'd used to calm spooked horses. She was already calculating. The man was easily twice her size, but desperation had made stranger things possible. "Can you make it to the porch?" He nodded, struggling to his knees. Together they managed the torturous journey to her small cabin. Once inside, Cordelia lit every lamp she had while the stranger collapsed onto her kitchen floor, still cradling the baby. In the light, she could see him clearly for the first time. Lakota certainly, with the high cheekbones and copper skin, but there was something else in his features, perhaps French or Spanish blood from generations past. His clothes were a mixture of traditional and white man's garments, and around his neck hung both a medicine bag and a simple wooden cross. "What's your name?" she asked, fetching clean cloths and her medicine box. "Kieran," he said, the name coming out strangely. Kieran Crowfeather. It was clearly not the name he'd been born with, but she didn't press. Half the folks in Cedar Falls had reinvented themselves at one point or another. And her? Cordelia nodded toward the baby, who had begun crying again with renewed vigor. A good sign. Iana. It means eternal blossom. His voice broke slightly. Her mother chose it before. He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Cordelia had seen enough of life's cruelties in her 28 years to recognize fresh grief. "Well then, Kieran Crowfeather, let's get you both warmed and fed before we worry about anything else." She began cleaning a deep gash on his shoulder. "You can tell me how you came to be in my cornfield once you're not bleeding all over my floor." As she worked, Cordelia tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her with those dark, grateful eyes. She'd been alone on her small farm for 2 years now, ever since consumption took her husband, and she'd grown accustomed to the solitude. But something about this man and his baby daughter stirred feelings she'd thought buried with Benjamin. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside her small cabin, something new was beginning. By morning, the storm had passed, but Cordelia's troubles were just beginning. She woke to find Kieran sitting by her kitchen window, Ayana sleeping peacefully in his arms. He'd cleaned himself up as best he could with her wash basin, braiding his hair back and changing into a spare shirt of her late husband's that stretched tight across his broader frame. "I should go," he said when he noticed her stirring. "You've done enough." "Go where?" Cordelia challenged, settling the coffee pot on the stove. "You can barely stand, and that baby needs regular feeding. Besides, you haven't told me why you were wandering through a thunderstorm with an infant." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his fingers gently stroking his daughter's tiny fist. "My wife died in childbirth 3 months ago. Her people, they blamed me, said I brought death to their village by marrying outside the tribe. They cast us out." "And your people?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "My mother was French-Canadian, my father Lakota. I belong fully to neither world. The reservation won't have me because of my mixed blood and my Christian faith. The white settlements," he gestured to his face. "Well, you can see the problem." Cordelia poured 2 cups of coffee, her mind working. "What skills do you have? I can work horses, hunt, track, build. I read and write in 3 languages. My wife taught me to weave baskets, and I know healing. Plants from both traditions. Then you'll stay until you're healed and have earned enough to start somewhere else, she decided. I need help with the harvest, and this baby needs stability. But the decision was taken from them before noon. Cordelia had just stepped out to milk her cow when she saw the dust cloud approaching. 6 riders from town, led by Mayor Cornelius, Pike and Sheriff Vernon Walsh. "Morning, Cordelia," Pike called out, though his eyes were fixed on Kieran, who had emerged from the cabin at the sound of horses. "Folks in town are saying you've got yourself a savage staying here." "Folks in town need to mind their own business," Cordelia replied evenly. "This is my land, not when it affects the safety of decent people," Sheriff Walsh interjected. "We've had reports of missing livestock, and now there's a redskin in the area. His name is Kieran Crow Feather. He's hurt, and he has a baby," Cordelia snapped. "Unless you're accusing an infant of cattle rustling, Vernon Walsh, I suggest you look elsewhere for your thief." But the men's attention had shifted to Ayanna, who had begun to fuss in Kieran's arms. The baby's skin was lighter than her father's, her hair showing hints of brown rather than pure black. "Half-breed," one of the men muttered, and Cordelia saw Kieran's jaw tighten. "That baby looks mighty pale for full Indian," Pike observed with a calculating look. "Makes a man wonder what kind of woman her mother was." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Kieran took a step forward, his free hand clenching into a fist, but Cordelia moved between him and the men. "Get off my land," she said quietly but with steel in her voice. "Now." "Cordelia, be reasonable," Pike tried again. "This man is dangerous. Look at those scars, the way he carries himself. He's a warrior. He's a father trying to protect his child," she shot back. "Something you'd understand if you had any decency left in you. The confrontation might have escalated, but little Ayanna chose that moment to let out a piercing wail. The sound seemed to break the tension, reminding everyone present that they were arguing over a man with a hungry baby. "This isn't over," Pike warned as they turned to leave. "The town won't stand for this, Cordelia. You'll bring trouble on all of us." As the riders disappeared back toward town, Cordelia felt Kieran's presence behind her. "I should leave," he said. Again, but with less conviction than before. "Let them try to make us," Cordelia replied, surprising herself with the word us. Cedar Falls could use a little shaking up anyway. 3 weeks passed before either of them acknowledged what was growing between them. Kieran proved himself invaluable around the farm. He repaired the barn roof that had leaked for 2 years, built a proper chicken coop, and somehow coaxed her stubborn vegetable garden into producing twice its normal yield. More importantly, he showed Cordelia a gentleness she'd never seen in a man, the way he cared for Ayanna with infinite patience, singing to her in Lakota while he rocked her to sleep. But it was the small moments that undid Cordelia's carefully constructed walls. The way he always poured her coffee first in the mornings. How he'd started leaving wildflowers on her kitchen table. Not as a romantic gesture, he claimed, but because the baby likes colors. The evening when she'd found him reading aloud from her only book, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, his accented English turning the familiar words into something exotic and beautiful. "Where did you learn to read like that?" she'd asked, settling beside him on the porch steps. "Missionary school," he'd replied, Ayanna drowsy in his arms. "From age 7 to 14. They tried to beat the Indian out of us, but they gave us books in return. I thought it was a fair trade at the time. And now," he'd been quiet for a moment, studying the sunset. "Now I think maybe they were both wrong. The missionaries who said I had to choose between being Indian and being human, and the traditionalists who said I couldn't be Lakota if I learned white man's ways. Maybe a person can be many things at once." That was the night Cordelia first felt the urge to reach for his hand, though she'd stopped herself just in time. The town's hostility continued. No one would trade with Cordelia at the general store, and several families had made it clear that her presence was no longer welcome at Sunday services. But for every door that closed, an unexpected one opened. Old Henrik Andersen, the Norwegian widower who farmed the adjacent property, began stopping by with surplus vegetables and stayed to help with heavy work. Mrs. Chen from the laundry took to bringing baby clothes that her own grandchildren had outgrown. People are not all bad, Kieran observed one evening as they watched Ayana gurgle happily in the wooden cradle he'd carved for her. Just frightened. You're more forgiving than I'd be, Cordelia replied. They've treated you terribly. I've seen worse. His fingers absently traced a scar along his jaw. There was a time I thought anger was strength. My wife taught me different. She said true strength is knowing when to fight and when to forgive. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. He looked at Cordelia then, and she saw something new in his expression. Not the desperate gratitude of those first days, but something warmer and more complex. She would have liked you. You have the same fierce heart. The compliment should have pleased her, but instead it reminded Cordelia of the gap between them, his love for his late wife, so recently lost, and her own growing feelings that felt both inevitable and impossible. That night, she lay awake listening to Kieran's quiet movements in the next room as he tended to Ayana, and admitted to herself what she'd been fighting for weeks. She was falling in love with this man and his daughter, and it terrified her more than any town gossip or social censure ever could, because loving them meant the possibility of losing them, and Cordelia Whitmore had already lost too much to bear, losing anything else. But in the morning, when she found Kieran in the kitchen making breakfast with Ayana babbling contentedly in his arms, all her fears seemed less important than the simple fact of their presence filling her empty house with life and purpose once again. "Good morning," he said, and the ordinary word sounded like a promise. "Good morning," she replied, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. The trouble came, as Cordelia had known it would, on a crisp October morning when the leaves were turning gold and red around her small farm. She was hanging laundry when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats, not the measured pace of a few men this time, but the chaotic drumming of an angry mob. 23 men from town, led by Mayor Pike and backed by several strangers Cordelia didn't recognize. Men with hard eyes and the look of those who'd made violence their profession. Kieran emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harnesses, but instead of the defensive stance she expected, he walked calmly to where Ayana lay sleeping in, her basket on the porch. He picked up his daughter and held her close, his movements deliberate and peaceful. "Cordelia Whitmore," Pike called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man backed by superior numbers. "You've harbored this savage long enough. We're here to restore order to this community. The only disorder I see is you and your mob. On my property without invitation," Cordelia replied, moving to stand beside Kieran. Up close she could smell whiskey on several of the men. Liquid courage for what they'd come to do. "This isn't about you, woman," one of the strangers growled. "We've got reports this Indian's been stealing cattle from ranches 30 miles south. There's a reward for his capture." Cordelia felt the lie in her bones. Kieran had never left her property except to hunt in the nearby woods, and always with her knowledge. This was about something else entirely. The way he'd made her farm prosperous, the way he'd proven himself to be more man than any of them, the way his very existence challenged their assumptions about who deserved respect in their small corner of the world. "Show me your warrant," she demanded. "Don't need a warrant for a rogue Indian," Pike snapped. "This is frontier justice." "This is cowardice," Kieran spoke for the first time, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. He shifted Ayana higher on his chest, and Cordelia realized he was positioning himself to shield her with his body if violence erupted. 23 armed men against one person with a baby. Your ancestors would be ashamed." Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, but Pike pressed forward. "You've got a smart mouth for someone in your position, Savage. Maybe it's time someone taught you your place." "My place," Kieran said quietly, "is protecting my daughter and the woman who showed us kindness when we needed it most. If that's a crime worthy of death, then I'll face it standing here." The words hit Cordelia like a physical blow. The woman who showed us kindness? Is that all she was to him? A kind stranger who'd taken them in from the storm? But then she looked, at his face, really looked, and saw something that made her heart skip. The way his free hand had moved protectively toward her without conscious thought. The set of his shoulders that said he was prepared to die for her as readily as for his child. "You're not facing anything alone," she heard herself say, stepping even closer to his side. "Cordelia, no," he whispered urgently. "Take Ayanna and go inside. This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't." She raised her voice to carry to the assembled men. "This is my land, and these are my people under my protection. Anyone who wants to harm them will have to go through me first." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Cordelia could see some of the men wavering. She'd been born in Cedar Falls, had nursed their wives through difficult births, had brought food to their families during hard winters. They might disapprove of her choices, but few were prepared to actually harm her. But Pike and his hired guns were made of harder stuff. "So be it," Pike said, reaching for his pistol. "If you want to throw your lot in with savages, you can share their fate." The next few moments unfolded with terrible clarity. Pike's gun clearing leather, Kieran pushing Cordelia behind him while clutching Ayanna, the baby's startled cry as she sensed the danger around her, and then Henrik Anderson's voice booming. Across the yard, "That's far enough, Pike." The old Norwegian farmer stood at the edge of Cordelia's property with a shotgun in his hands, and Mrs. Chen beside him holding a rifle with surprising competence. Behind them came a handful of others, people Cordelia had helped over the years, neighbors who'd stayed silent during the town's ostracism, but drew the line at actual violence. "This is a private dispute," Pike blustered, but his gun hand had hesitated. "This is attempted murder," Henrik replied calmly. "And I don't care what color a man's skin is. I won't stand by and watch good people be gunned down by a mob." The standoff stretched taut as a wire, 23 against 7. Violence hanging in the balance like a blade above their heads. Then Ayanna laughed, a pure, delighted sound that cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. The baby had noticed a butterfly dancing near her father's shoulder and was reaching for it with tiny fingers. In that moment of innocent joy, the mob's bloodlust seemed suddenly obscene. The mob dispersed slowly, Pike and his hired guns making threats about next time, and justice delayed. But the immediate danger had passed. Henrik and the others stayed until the last rider disappeared over the hill, then quietly took their leave with promises to keep watch. Cordelia found herself alone with Kieran and Ayanna as the sun began to set, painting her small farm in shades of gold and crimson. The baby had fallen asleep in her father's arms, exhausted by the day's excitement, and he was rocking her gently on the porch steps. "Thank you," he said without looking at Cordelia, "for what you did today. You risked everything." "So did you." She sat beside him, close enough to smell the scent of wood smoke and leather that seemed to cling to his clothes. "You were ready to die for us. For you," he corrected softly. "Ayanna is my blood, my responsibility. But you." He turned to face her then, and in his dark eyes she saw all the words he'd been holding back. "You are my choice." Cordelia's breath caught in her throat. "Kieran?" "I know it's too soon," he continued, the words coming faster now as if he'd been rehearsing them for weeks. "I know you loved your husband, and I loved my wife, and maybe we're both too damaged to start again. But today, when I thought they might hurt you because of me, I realized that losing you would be worse than dying." "You're not too damaged," Cordelia whispered, reaching up to touch the scar along his jaw. "Neither of us is." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. "My wife has been gone 8 months now. The grief. It comes and goes like seasons. Some days I can barely remember her face. Other days the pain is so sharp I can't breathe. But you..." He opened his eyes, looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "You make me want to live again, not just survive." "I was dead inside when you came," Cordelia admitted. "Going through the motions of living, but not really. Alive. You and Ayanna. You brought light back into this house, into me. Kieran shifted slightly, moving Ayanna to one arm so he could reach for Cordelia's hand with the other. His palm was calloused from work, warm and steady. I have nothing to offer you, he said. No money, no land, no respectable place in any community. I'm a man between worlds with a mixed-blood child and more enemies than friends. You have yourself, Cordelia replied firmly. Your strength, your gentleness, your intelligence. You have Ayanna, who has brought more joy to this house than I thought possible. You have your hands that can fix anything, your voice that makes Shakespeare sound like music, your way of seeing beauty in simple things. And you have my heart, he said simply, if you want it. The words hung between them like a bridge across a chasm. Cordelia looked at this man who had stumbled into her life during a storm and somehow become essential to her happiness. Then, at the sleeping baby who had already claimed a piece of her soul. I want it all, she whispered. Your heart, your future, your daughter, as if she were my own. I want to build something new with you, something that doesn't fit into anyone else's idea of how life should be. Kieran released her hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone. The town will never accept us. Then we'll make our own community, Cordelia replied. With people like Henrik and Mrs. Chen, people who judge by character instead of color. We'll raise Ayanna to be proud of all her heritage, Lakota, French, and the love that brought us together. You would do that? Take on the disapproval, the isolation, the danger. Instead of answering with words, Cordelia leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, then deeper as he responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I would do anything for love, she said against his lips. Real love, the kind that makes you braver instead of smaller. The kind worth fighting for. Ayanna stirred in her father's arms, making soft baby sounds that indicated she would be waking soon and demanding attention. But for this moment, in the fading light of a day that had nearly ended in tragedy, Cordelia and Kieran held each other and their shared future close. So we're really doing this? He asked, wonder in his voice. We're really doing this, Cordelia confirmed. And for the first time since that stormy night when he'd collapsed in her cornfield, Kieran Crowfeather smiled with pure, uncomplicated happiness. Part 6. New Beginnings. Winter came early that year, blanketing the countryside in pristine white that seemed to muffle even the town's disapproval. Inside Cordelia's cabin, now truly their home, warmth radiated from more than just the wood-burning stove. They had married in a quiet ceremony performed by a traveling Methodist minister, witnessed by Henrik, Mrs. Chen, and 3 other neighbors, who had gradually joined their small circle of acceptance. Ayanna had taken her first tottering steps between Cordelia's outstretched arms and Kieran's encouraging hands, babbling words that seemed to combine English and Lakota in her own unique language. She called Cordelia Mama Cord, and had learned to clap her hands when her father played his wooden flute in the evenings. But it was the unexpected visitors who truly changed everything. Cordelia was kneading bread when she heard voices outside, not the harsh tones she'd learned to associate with trouble, but something softer, more musical. Through the window, she saw Kieran talking with 3 native women, 1 elderly and 2 younger, all dressed in a mixture of traditional and modern clothing. Cordelia, Kieran called, and she could hear the emotion in his voice. Please come, meet my grandmother. The elderly woman stepped forward as Cordelia emerged from the cabin, Ayanna balanced on her hip. Her hair was silver white, braided with beads and feathers, and her dark eyes held the wisdom of many seasons. So, she said in accented but clear English, you are the woman who saved my grandson and his daughter. I am Cordelia, she replied, uncertain of the proper protocol, but determined to show respect. I am Wikapinajin, Standing Star. These are my granddaughters, Ayanna's aunts. The old woman gestured to the younger women, who stepped forward with shy smiles. We have come to see the child and to thank the woman who showed kindness when our family showed only judgment. Kieran moved to Cordelia's side, his hand finding the small of her back. Grandmother, I told you, You told me you had fallen in love with a white woman and that I would disapprove. Wikapi Najin interrupted with a small smile. You did not tell me she had a warrior's heart and the wisdom to see past the color of skin to the content of spirit. Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes. You're welcome here, all of you always. We brought gifts, one of the younger women, introduced as Mape, Sky, said softly. She held out a beautifully beaded cradleboard for little Ayana, and she hesitated, then continued, for any future children you might have. The implication wasn't lost on any of them. Cordelia felt her cheeks warm as Kieran's arm tightened around her waist. We also brought something else, the other young woman. Wikape Star added. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. A letter from the Indian agent. There's been a change in policy regarding mixed families. Those who can prove stable homes and employment may be eligible for land grants under the new treaty. Kieran took the letter with trembling hands, scanning the official language. 160 acres, he breathed, for families demonstrating successful integration while maintaining cultural ties. The land adjoining your wife's property is still available for claim, Wikapi Najin observed. It would make quite a substantial farm. That evening, as they sat around Cordelia's expanded dinner table, two families now bound by love and choice, rather than just blood, plans began to form. The land could support not just farming but also the craft work that Kieran excelled at and the healing knowledge that his grandmother possessed. They could build something entirely new, a community that honored all traditions while creating space for innovation. There will still be resistance, Wikapi Najin warned as they talked late into the night. From both sides, some of my people will say Kieran has abandoned his heritage by marrying outside the tribe. Some of yours will say you've betrayed your race. Let them say what they will, Cordelia replied, watching Ayana sleep peacefully in Kieran's arms. We'll know who we are. And who are we? Mapi asked with genuine curiosity. Cordelia looked around the room, at Kieran with his daughter, at the 3 Lakota women who had traveled so far to bridge a gap that anger had torn open, at the simple cabin that had somehow become the center of something revolutionary. We're family, she said simply. Not because we share blood, but because we choose each other every day. We're the future, messy and complicated and beautiful. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the earth in fresh possibility. Come spring, there would be new land to claim, houses to build, crops to plant, and children to raise in a world where love mattered more than the arbitrary divisions that kept people apart. But tonight, there was simply this: warmth and acceptance, and the radical act of building bridges instead of walls. Kieran began to sing softly in Lakota, a lullaby his grandmother had taught him. Wikapi Najin joined in, her ancient voice blending with his, and gradually the others added their voices, not in perfect harmony, but in the kind of beautiful discord that comes from different melodies finding ways to complement each other. Ayana stirred in her sleep, smiling, as if even in dreams she could sense the love surrounding her. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter rang across the valley where 2 farms had grown into a thriving community. Ayana, now 6, raced through the apple orchard, with her younger brother Benjamin, named for Cordelia's first husband with Kieran's blessing, and their cousin Little Wolf, Mapi's son. Behind them trailed a dozen other children of various ages and mixed heritage, their voices creating a joyful cacophony in 3 languages. Cordelia straightened from the vegetable garden she was tending, one hand pressed to her lower back where another child was beginning to make its presence known. At 43, she hadn't expected to be expecting again, but life had taught her to embrace its surprises. The school inspector arrives today, Kieran called from the porch of their new house, a large, beautiful structure that combined the best of both traditions, with wide windows for light and a central fireplace for gathering. The school had been Wikapi Najin's idea. If they were going to raise children who belonged to multiple worlds, those children needed education that honored all their heritage. The one-room schoolhouse they'd built served not just their own families, but children from 3 counties whose parents wanted something more than the rigid, often cruel education available in traditional schools. Mrs. Whitmore Crow-Feather, the inspector, a thin, nervous man named Patterson, greeted Cordelia with obvious uncertainty. He'd been sent by the territorial government to investigate reports of an irregular educational situation, but seemed unsure how to address a woman with a hyphenated surname that bridged two cultures. "Just Cordelia will be fine," she replied with the warm authority she'd learned to wield over the years. "Would you like to observe our classes?" Inside the schoolhouse, Ayanna stood before a map of North America, confidently pointing out tribal territories while speaking in fluent Lakota. At the next station, Benjamin was demonstrating basic arithmetic using both Arabic numerals and traditional counting methods. Near the window, a group of older children worked on a translation project, moving between English, French, and Lakota with impressive fluency. "This is highly irregular," Patterson murmured, taking notes furiously. "This is highly effective," corrected Henrik Anderson, who had become the community's unofficial representative to outside authorities. Now in his 70s, but still sharp, he'd taken particular pride in the success of their experimental approach. These children test higher in all subjects than the county average. But the mixing of cultures, the languages, Patterson seemed genuinely distressed, produces more intelligent, adaptable, and empathetic human beings, Kieran said quietly, appearing beside them. Over the years, he'd grown into his role as teacher and community leader, his natural dignity earning respect, even from those who'd initially doubted him. "Isn't that what education is supposed to do?" The inspection continued through the afternoon, Patterson growing increasingly flustered as he encountered innovations that didn't fit his preconceived notions. Children who learned geography by hearing first-hand accounts from tribal elders and immigrant families. Mathematics taught through both Western techniques and traditional native problem-solving methods. Literature that included Shakespeare alongside ancient oral traditions. "I'll need to file a full report," he finally said, clearly uncomfortable with what he'd witnessed. "Of course," Cordelia agreed. "Please do include test scores and attendance rates. I think you'll find them quite favorable." After Patterson left, the community gathered for their weekly feast, a tradition that had evolved to include everyone. The original farm families, the Lakota relatives who'd gradually relocated to be closer, the Norwegian and German immigrants who'd joined them, even Mrs. Chen's extended family who'd moved from town as it became increasingly clear that Cedar Falls' narrow-mindedness was a losing proposition. "Do you think he'll cause trouble?" Mahpe asked, bouncing her youngest daughter on her knee. "Let him try," Wikapi Najin said with the confidence of her 80-some years. "We have results on our side. Happy children, strong families, prosperous farms. What more can they ask for?" As the sun set over their valley, Cordelia found herself standing with Kieran on the porch of their home, watching their extended family clean up from the feast. Children ran between the houses, adults lingered in conversation, and the whole scene radiated contentment and belonging. "Do you ever regret it?" Kieran asked, as he did sometimes in quiet moments. "The life you could have had if you'd made different choices." Cordelia leaned into his solid warmth, her hand moving instinctively to her growing belly. "The only life I regret is the one I wasted before you came. All those years of just existing instead of truly living." Ayanna bounded up to them, her face flushed from play and her hair a tangle of dark waves that caught the lamplight. She was beautiful in a way that transcended any single heritage, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin and something entirely her own in her brilliant smile. "Mama Cord, Papa, look what grandmother taught us today." She held up a small woven basket, perfectly crafted despite her young age. "It's beautiful, Little Blossom," Kieran said, using his pet name for her. "She said baskets are like families." Ayanna continued seriously. "Different grasses woven together, stronger than any single strand could be alone." Cordelia met Kieran's eyes over their daughter's head, both of them thinking of that stormy night 8 years ago, when a desperate man with a baby in his arms had collapsed in a muddy cornfield. How that moment of crisis had become the foundation for something unprecedented and wonderful. Grandmother is very wise, Cordelia agreed, pulling Ayana close. Later, after the children were finally settled and the house had grown quiet, Cordelia and Kieran sat by their own fire, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting gently on her belly where new life grew. "What should we name this one?" he asked softly. "Hope," Cordelia said without hesitation. "If it's a girl, Hope. If it's a boy, maybe Nathan, it means gift." Hope or gift, Kieran mused. Both seem fitting for a child born into love instead of fear. Outside their windows, the community they'd built together settled into peaceful sleep. Families of every background and heritage, united not by blood or tradition alone, but by the revolutionary belief that love could indeed conquer the artificial. Divisions that kept people apart. In years to come, their little valley would become famous throughout the territory as a model of successful integration. Their school would train teachers for other experimental programs, and their children would grow up to become leaders, artists, healers, and bridges between worlds. But that night, all that mattered was this: a woman who had once thought her capacity for love had died with her first husband, a man who had been cast out by both his peoples, a little girl who belonged fully to neither world and completely to both, and the radical act of choosing family over fear, hope over hatred, love over all the forces that conspired to keep hearts separate. Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with armies or politics, but with one person deciding to open their door to a stranger in a storm. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the simple daily choice to love without conditions, to build bridges instead of walls, to see possibility where others see only problems. And sometimes when the storm finally passes and the sun breaks through the clouds, what remains is not just survival, but transformation. The kind that turns outcasts into founders, strangers into family, and broken hearts into something stronger than they ever were before. In the gathering dusk of their valley, surrounded by the laughter of children who would never know the limitations their parents had faced, Cordelia and Kieran held each other close and knew with absolute certainty that every moment of struggle, every act of courage, every choice to love despite the cost had led them exactly where they were meant to be: home, together, forever.